Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoy this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 17. These last words justified the colonist's presentiment. There had been some mournful past, perhaps expiated in the sight of men, but from which his conscience had not yet absolved him. At any rate, the guilty man felt remorse. He repented, and his new friends would have cordially pressed the hand which they sought, but he did not feel himself worthy to extend it to honest men. However, after the scene with the jaguar, he did not return to the forest, and from that day did not go beyond the enclosure of Granite House. What was the mystery of his life? Would the stranger one day speak of it? Time alone could tell. At any rate, it was agreed that his secret should never be asked of him, and that they would live with him as if they suspected nothing. For some days, their life continued as before. Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett worked together, sometimes chemists, sometimes experimentalists. The reporter never left the engineer except to hunt with Herbert, for it would not have been prudent to allow the lad to ramble alone in the forest, and it was very necessary to be on their guard. As to Neb and Pencroft, one day at the stables and poultry yard, another at the corral, without reckoning work in Granite House, they were never in want of employment. The stranger worked alone, and he had resumed his usual life, never appearing at meals, sleeping under the trees on the plateau, never mingling with his companions. It really seemed as if the society of those who had saved him was insupportable to him. But then, observed Pencroft, why did he entreat the help of his fellow creatures? Why did he throw that paper into the sea? He will tell us why, invariably replied Cyrus Harding. When? Perhaps sooner than you think, Pencroft. And indeed, the day of confession was near. On the 10th of December, a week after his return to Granite House, Harding saw the stranger approaching, who, in a calm voice and humble tone, said to him, "Sir, I have a request to make of you." "Speak," answered the engineer, "but first let me ask you a question." At these words the stranger reddened, and was on the point of withdrawing. Cyrus Harding understood what was passing in the mind of the guilty man, who doubtless feared that the engineer would interrogate him on his past life. Harding held him back. "Comrade," said he, "we are not only your companions, but your friends. I wish you to believe that, and now I will listen to you." The stranger pressed his hand over his eyes. He was seized with a sort of trembling, and remained a few moments without being able to articulate a word. "Sir," said he at last, "I have come to beg you to grant me a favor." "What is it?" "You have 4 or 5 miles from here a corral for your domesticated animals. These animals need to be taken care of. Will you allow me to live there with them?" Cyrus Harding gazed at the unfortunate man for a few moments with a feeling of deep commiseration. Then, "My friend," said he, "the corral has only stables hardly fit for animals." "It will be good enough for me, sir." "My friend," answered Harding, "we will not constrain you in anything. You wish to live at the corral? So be it. You will, however, be always welcome at Granite House. But since you wish to live at the corral, we will make the necessary arrangements for your being comfortably established there." "Never mind that. I shall do very well." "My friend," answered Harding, who always intentionally made use of this cordial appellation, you must let us judge what it will be best to do in this respect." "Thank you, sir," replied the stranger as he withdrew. The engineer then made known to his companions the proposal which had been made to him, and it was agreed that they should build a wooden house at the corral, which they would make as comfortable as possible. That very day the colonists repaired to the corral with the necessary tools, and a week had not passed before the house was ready to receive its tenant. It was built about 20 feet from the sheds, and from there it was easy to overlook the flock of sheep, which then numbered more than 80. Some furniture, a bed, table, bench, cupboard, and chest were manufactured, and a gun, ammunition, and tools were carried to the corral. The stranger, however, had seen nothing of his new dwelling, and he had allowed the settlers to work there without him, while he occupied himself at the plateau, wishing, doubtless, to put the finishing stroke to his work. Indeed, thanks to him, all the ground was dug up and ready to be sowed when the time came. It was on the 20th of December that all the arrangements at the corral were completed. The engineer announced to the stranger that his dwelling was ready to receive him, and the latter replied that he would go and sleep there that very evening. On this evening the colonists were gathered in the dining room of Granite House. It was then 8 o'clock, the hour at which their companion was to leave them. Not wishing to trouble him by their presence, and thus imposing on him the necessity of saying farewells which might perhaps be painful to him, they had left him alone and ascended to Granite House. Now they had been talking in the room for a few minutes, when a light knock was heard at the door. Almost immediately the stranger entered, and without any preamble, "Gentlemen," said he, "before I leave you, it is right that you should know my history. I will tell it to you." These simple words profoundly impressed Cyrus Harding and his companions. The engineer rose. "We ask you nothing, my friend," said he. "It is your right to be silent." "It is my duty to speak." "Sit down, then." "No, I will stand." "We are ready to hear you," replied Harding. The stranger remained standing in a corner of the room, a little in the shade. He was bareheaded, his arms folded across his chest, and it was in this posture that in a hoarse voice, speaking like someone who obliges himself to speak, he gave the following recital, which his auditors did not once interrupt. On the 20th of December, 1854, a steam yacht belonging to a Scotch nobleman, Lord Glenarvan, anchored off Cape Bernouilli on the western coast of Australia in the 37th parallel. On board this yacht were Lord Glenarvan and his wife, a major in the English army, a French geographer, a young girl, and a young boy. These two last were the children of Captain Grant, whose ship, the Britannia, had been lost, crew and cargo, a year before. The Duncan was commanded by Captain John Mangles and manned by a crew of 15 men. This is the reason the yacht at this time lay off the coast of Australia. 6 months before, a bottle, enclosing a document written in English, German, and French, had been found in the Irish Sea and picked up by the Duncan. This document stated in substance that there still existed 3 survivors from the wreck of the Britannia, that these survivors were Captain Grant and 2 of his men, and that they had found refuge on some land, of which the document gave the latitude, but of which the longitude, effaced by the sea, was no longer legible. The latitude was 37 degrees, 11 minutes south. Therefore, the longitude being unknown, if they followed the 37th parallel over continents and seas, they would be certain to reach the spot inhabited by Captain Grant and his 2 companions. The English Admiralty, having hesitated to undertake this search, Lord Glenarvan resolved to attempt everything to find the captain. He communicated with Mary and Robert Grant, who joined him. The Duncan yacht was equipped for the distant voyage in which the nobleman's family and the captain's children wished to take part, and the Duncan, leaving Glasgow, proceeded towards the Atlantic, passed through the Straits of Magellan, and ascended the Pacific as far as Patagonia, where, according to a previous interpretation of the document, they supposed that Captain Grant was a prisoner among the Indians. The Duncan disembarked her passengers on the western coast of Patagonia and sailed to pick them up again on the eastern coast at Cape Corrientes. Lord Glenarvan traversed Patagonia, following the 37th parallel, and having found no trace of the captain, he re-embarked on the 13th of November, so as to pursue his search through the ocean. After having unsuccessfully visited the islands of Tristan da Cunha and Amsterdam, situated in her course, the Duncan, as I have said, arrived at Cape Bernoulli on the Australian coast on the 20th of December, 1854. It was Lord Glenarvan's intention to traverse Australia as he had traversed America, and he disembarked. A few miles from the coast was established a farm belonging to an Irishman who offered hospitality to the travelers. Lord Glenarvan made note to the Irishman the cause which had brought him to these parts, and asked if he knew whether a 3-masted English vessel, the Britannia, had been lost less than 2 years before on the west coast of Australia. The Irishman had never heard of this wreck, but to the great surprise of the bystanders, one of his servants came forward and said, "My lord, praise and thank God. If Captain Grant is still living, he is living on the Australian shores." "Who are you?" asked Lord Glenarvan. "A Scotchman like yourself, my lord," replied the man. "I am one of Captain Grant's crew, one of the castaways of the Britannia." This man was called Ayrton. He was, in fact, the boatswain's mate from the Britannia, as his papers showed, but separated from Captain Grant at the moment when the ship struck upon the rocks. He had till then believed that the captain, with all his crew, had perished, and that he, Ayrton, was the sole survivor of the Britannia. "Only," he added, "it was not on the west coast, but on the east coast of Australia that the vessel was lost, and if Captain Grant is still living, as his document indicates, he is a prisoner among the natives, and it is on the other coast that he must be looked for." This man spoke in a frank voice, and with a confident look. His words could not be doubted. The Irishman, in whose service he had been for more than a year, answered for his trustworthiness. Lord Glenarvan, therefore, believed in the fidelity of this man, and by his advice resolved to cross Australia, following the 37th parallel. Lord Glenarvan, his wife, the 2 children, the Major, the Frenchman, Captain Mangles, and a few sailors composed the little band under the command of Ayrton, while the Duncan, under charge of the mate, Tom Austin, proceeded to Melbourne, there to await Lord Glenarvan's instructions. They set out on the 23rd of December, 1854. It is time to say that Ayrton was a traitor. He was indeed the boatswain's mate of the Britannia, but after some dispute with his captain, he endeavored to incite the crew to mutiny and seize the ship, and Captain Grant had landed him on the 8th of April, 1852, on the west coast of Australia, and then sailed, leaving him there, as was only just. Therefore, this wretched man knew nothing of the wreck of the Britannia. He had just heard of it from Glenarvan's account. Since his abandonment, he had become, under the name of Ben Joyce, the leader of the escaped convicts, and if he boldly maintained that the wreck had taken place on the east coast and led Lord Glenarvan to proceed in that direction, it was that he hoped to separate him from his ship, seize the Duncan, and make the yacht a pirate in the Pacific. Here the stranger stopped for a moment. His voice trembled, but he continued. The expedition set out and proceeded across Australia. It was inevitably unfortunate, since Ayrton, or Ben Joyce as he may be called, guided it, sometimes preceded, sometimes followed by his band of convicts who had been told what they had to do. Meanwhile, the Duncan had been sent to Melbourne for repairs. It was necessary then to get Lord Glenarvan to order her to leave Melbourne and go to the east coast of Australia, where it would be easy to seize her. After having led the expedition near enough to the coast, in the midst of vast forests with no resources, Ayrton obtained a letter which he was charged to carry to the mate of the Duncan, a letter which ordered the yacht to repair immediately to the east coast, to Twofold Bay, that is to say, a few days' journey from the place where the expedition had stopped. It was there that Ayrton had agreed to meet his accomplices, and 2 days after gaining possession of the letter, he arrived at Melbourne. So far, the villain had succeeded in his wicked design. He would be able to take the Duncan into Twofold Bay, where it would be easy for the convicts to seize her and her crew massacred. Ben Joyce would become master of the seas, but it pleased God to prevent the accomplishment of these terrible projects. Ayrton arrived at Melbourne, delivered the letter to the mate, Tom Austin, who read it and immediately set sail. But judge of Ayrton's rage and disappointment when the next day he found that the mate was taking the vessel not to the east coast of Australia, to Twofold Bay, but to the east coast of New Zealand. He wished to stop him, but Austin showed him the letter, and indeed, by a providential error of the French geographer who had written the letter, the east coast of New Zealand was mentioned at the place of destination. All Ayrton's plans were frustrated. He became outrageous. They put him in irons. He was then taken to the coast of New Zealand, not knowing what would become of his accomplices or what would become of Lord Glenarvan. The Duncan cruised about on this coast until the 3rd of March. On that day, Ayrton heard the report of guns. The guns on the Duncan were being fired, and soon Lord Glenarvan and his companions came on board. This is what had happened. After 1,000 hardships, 1,000 dangers, Lord Glenarvan had accomplished his journey and arrived on the east coast of Australia at Twofold Bay. No Duncan. He telegraphed to Melbourne. They answered. Duncan sailed on the 18th instant, destination unknown. Lord Glenarvan could only arrive at one conclusion, that his honest yacht had fallen into the hands of Ben Joyce and had become a pirate vessel. However, Lord Glenarvan would not give up. He was a bold and generous man. He embarked in a merchant vessel, sailed to the west coast of New Zealand, traversed it along the 37th parallel without finding any trace of Captain Grant. But on the other side, to his great surprise, and by the will of heaven, he found the Duncan under command of the mate, who had been waiting for him for 5 weeks. This was on the 3rd of March, 1855. Lord Glenarvan was now on board the Duncan, but Ayrton was there also. He appeared before the nobleman, who wished to extract from him all that the villain knew about Captain Grant. Ayrton refused to speak. Lord Glenarvan then told him that at the first port they put into, he would be delivered up to the English authorities. Ayrton remained mute. The Duncan continued her voyage along the 37th parallel. In the meanwhile, Lady Glenarvan... Let's redo this part. The Duncan continued her voyage along the 37th parallel. In the meanwhile, Lady Glenarvan undertook to vanquish the resistance of the ruffian. At last, her influence prevailed, and Ayrton, in exchange for what he could tell, proposed that Lord Glenarvan should leave him on some island in the Pacific, instead of giving him up to the English authorities. Lord Glenarvan, resolving to do anything to obtain information about Captain Grant, consented. Ayrton then related all his life, and it was certain that he knew nothing from the day on which Captain Grant had landed him on the Australian coast. Nonetheless, Lord Glenarvan kept the promise which he had given. The Duncan continued her voyage and arrived at Tabor Island. It was there that Ayrton was to be landed, and it was there also that, by a veritable miracle, they found Captain Grant and 2 men, exactly on the 37th parallel. The convict then went to take their place on this desert island, and at the moment he left the yacht, these words were pronounced by Lord Glenarvan: "Here, Ayrton, you will be far from any land, and without any possible communication with your fellow creatures. You cannot escape from this islet on which the Duncan leaves you. You will be alone under the eye of a God who reads the depths of the heart, but you will be neither lost nor forgotten, as was Captain Grant. Unworthy as you are to be remembered by men, men will remember you. I know where you are, Ayrton, and I know where to find you. I will never forget it." And the Duncan, making sail, soon disappeared. This was the 18th of March, 1855. The events which have just been briefly related are taken from a work which some of our readers have no doubt read, and which is entitled Captain Grant's Children. They will remark on this occasion, as well as later, some discrepancy in the dates, but later again they will understand why the real dates were not at first given. Ayrton was alone, but he had no want of either ammunition, weapons, tools, or seeds. At the convict's disposal, was the house built by honest Captain Grant. He had only to live and expiate in solitude the crimes which he had committed. Gentlemen, he repented. He was ashamed of his crimes and was very miserable. He said to himself that if men came someday to take him from the islet, he must be worthy to return among them. How he suffered, that wretched man! How he labored to recover himself by work! How he prayed to be reformed by prayer! For 2 years, 3 years, this went on. But Ayrton, humbled by solitude, always looking for some ship to appear on the horizon, asking himself if the time of expiation would soon be complete, suffered as none other suffered. Oh, how dreadful was this solitude to a heart tormented by remorse. But doubtless heaven had not sufficiently punished this unhappy man, for he felt that he was gradually becoming a savage. He felt that brutishness was gradually gaining on him. He could not say if it was after 2 or 3 years of solitude, but at last he became the miserable creature you found. I have no need to tell you, gentlemen, that Ayrton, Ben Joyce, and I are the same. Cyrus Harding and his companions rose at the end of this account. It is impossible to say how much they were moved, what misery, grief, and despair they revealed before them. Ayrton, said Harding, rising, you have been a great criminal, but heaven must certainly think that you've expiated your crimes. That has been proved by your having been brought again among your fellow creatures. Ayrton, you're forgiven, and now you will be our companion? Ayrton drew back. Here is my hand, said the engineer. Ayrton grasped the hand which Harding extended to him, and great tears fell from his eyes. Will you live with us? Asked Cyrus Harding. Captain Harding, leave me some time longer, replied Ayrton. Leave me alone in the hut in the corral. As you like, Ayrton, answered Cyrus Harding. Ayrton was going to withdraw when the engineer addressed one more question to him. One word more, my friend. Since it was your intention to live alone, why did you throw into the sea the document which put us on your track? A document? Repeated Ayrton, who did not appear to know what he meant. Yes, the document which we found enclosed in a bottle, giving us the exact position of Tabor Island. Ayrton passed his hand over his brow. Then, after having thought, I never threw any document into the sea, he answered. Never? Exclaimed Pencroft. Never. And Ayrton, bowing, reached the door and departed. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Poor man, said Herbert, who had rushed to the door, but returned, having seen Ayrton slide down the rope on the lift and disappear in the darkness. He will come back, said Cyrus Harding. Come now, Captain, exclaimed Pencroft. What does that mean? What? Was it Ayrton who threw that bottle into the sea? Who was it, then? Certainly, if ever a question was necessary to be made, it was that one. It was he, answered Neb. Only the unhappy man was half mad. Yes, said Herbert, and he was no longer conscious of what he was doing. It can only be explained in that way, my friends, replied Harding quickly, and I understand now how Ayrton was able to point out exactly the situation of Tabor Island, since the events which had preceded his being left on the island had made it known to him. However, observed Pencroft, if he was not yet a brute when he wrote that document, and if he threw it into the sea 7 or 8 years ago, how is it that the paper has not been injured by damp? That proves, answered Cyrus Harding, that Ayrton was deprived of intelligence at a more recent time than he thinks. Of course, it must be so, replied Pencroft. Without that, the fact would be unaccountable. Unaccountable indeed, answered the engineer, who did not appear desirous to prolong the conversation. But has Ayrton told the truth? asked the sailor. Yes, replied the reporter. The story which he has told is true in every point. I remember quite well the account of the newspapers of the yacht expedition undertaken by Lord Glenarvan, and its result. Ayrton has told the truth, added Harding. Do not doubt it, Pencroft, for it was painful to him. People tell the truth when they accuse themselves like that. The next day, the 21st of December, the colonists descended on the beach, and having climbed the plateau, they found nothing of Ayrton. He had reached his house in the corral during the night, and the settlers judged it best not to agitate him by their presence. Time would doubtless perform what sympathy had been unable to accomplish. Herbert, Pencroft, and Neb resumed their ordinary occupations, On this day, the same work brought Harding and the reporter to the workshop at the Chimneys. "Do you know, Major Cyrus," said Gideon Spilett, "that the explanation you gave yesterday on the subject of the bottle has not satisfied me at all. How can it be supposed that the unfortunate man was able to write that document and throw the bottle into the sea without having the slightest recollection of it?" "Nor was it he who threw it in, my dear Spilett." "You think then—" "I think nothing. I know nothing," interrupted Cyrus Harding. "I am content to rank this incident among those which I have not yet been able to explain to this day." "Indeed, Cyrus," said Spilett, "these things are incredible. Your rescue, the case stranded on the sand, Top's adventure, and lastly this bottle. Shall we never have the answer to these enigmas?" "Yes," replied the engineer quickly. "Yes, even if I have to penetrate into the bowels of this island. Chance will perhaps give us the key to this mystery." "Chance? Spilett, I do not believe in chance any more than I believe in mysteries in this world. There is a reason for everything unaccountable which has happened here, and that reason I shall discover. But in the meantime, we must work and observe." The month of January arrived. The year 1867 commenced. The summer occupations were assiduously continued. During the days which followed, Herbert and Spilett, having gone in the direction of the corral, ascertained that Ayrton had taken possession of the habitation which had been prepared for him. He busied himself with the numerous flock confided to his care, and spared his companions the trouble of coming every 2 or 3 days to visit the corral. Nevertheless, in order not to leave Ayrton in solitude for too long a time, the settlers often paid him a visit. It was not unimportant either, in consequence of some suspicions entertained by the engineer and Gideon Spilett, that this part of the island should be subject to a surveillance of some sort, and that Ayrton, if any incident occurred unexpectedly, should not neglect to inform the inhabitants of Granite House of it. Nevertheless, it might happen that something would occur which it would be necessary to bring rapidly to the engineer's knowledge. Independently of facts bearing on the mystery of Lincoln Island, many others might happen which would call for the prompt interference of the colonists, such as the sighting of a vessel, a wreck on the western coast, the possible arrival of pirates, etc. Therefore, Cyrus Harding resolved to put the corral in instantaneous communication with Granite House. It was on the 10th of January that he made known his project to his companions. "Why, how are you going to manage that, Captain?" asked Pencroft. "Do you by chance happen to think of establishing a telegraph?" "Exactly so," answered the engineer. "Electric?" cried Herbert. "Electric," replied Cyrus Harding. "We have all the necessary materials for making a battery, and the most difficult thing will be to stretch the wires, but by means of a draw plate I think we shall manage it." "Well, after that," returned the sailor, "I shall never despair of seeing ourselves some day rolling along on a railway." They then set to work, beginning with the most difficult thing, for if they failed in that, it would be useless to manufacture the battery and other accessories. The iron of Lincoln Island, as has been said, was of excellent quality, and consequently very fit for being drawn out. Harding commenced by manufacturing a draw plate, that is to say, a plate of steel pierced with conical holes of different sizes, which would successively bring the wire to the wished-for tenacity. This piece of steel, after having been tempered, was fixed in as firm a way as possible in a solid framework planted in the ground, only a few feet from the great fall, the motive power of which the engineer intended to utilize. In fact, as the fulling mill was there, although not then in use, its beam, moved with extreme power, would serve to stretch out the wire by rolling it round itself. It was a delicate operation, and required much care. The iron, prepared previously in long, thin rods, the ends of which were sharpened with the file, having been introduced into the largest hole of the draw plate, was drawn out by the beam which wound it round itself to a length of 25 or 30 feet, then unrolled, and the same operation was performed successively through the holes of a less size. Finally, the engineer obtained wires from 40 to 50 feet long, which could be easily fastened together and stretched over the distance of 5 miles, which separated the corral from the bounds of Granite House. It did not take more than a few days to perform this work, and indeed, as soon as the machine had been commenced, Cyrus Harding left his companions to follow the trade of wire drawers and occupied himself with manufacturing his battery. It was necessary to obtain a battery with a constant current. It is known that the elements of modern batteries are generally composed of retort coal, zinc, and copper. Copper was absolutely wanting to the engineer who, notwithstanding all his researches, had never been able to find any trace of it in Lincoln Island, and was therefore obliged to do without it. Retort coal, that is to say the hard graphite which is found in the retorts of gas manufactories after the coal has been dehydrogenized, could have been obtained, but it would have been necessary to establish a special apparatus involving great labor. As to zinc, it may be remembered that the case found at Flotsam Point was lined with this metal, which could not be better utilized than for this purpose. Cyrus Harding, after mature consideration, decided to manufacture a very simple battery, resembling as nearly as possible that invented by Becquerel in 1820, and in which zinc only is employed. The other substances, azotic acid and potash, were all at his disposal. The way in which the battery was composed was as follows, and the results were to be attained by the reaction of acid and potash on each other. A number of glass bottles were made and filled with azotic acid. The engineer corked them by means of a stopper through which passed a glass tube, bored at its lower extremity, and intended to be plunged into the acid by means of a clay stopper secured by a rag. Into this tube, through its upper extremity, he poured a solution of potash previously obtained by burning and reducing to ashes various plants, and in this way the acid and potash could act on each other through the clay. Cyrus Harding then took 2 slips of zinc, one of which was plunged into azotic acid, the other into a solution of potash. A current was immediately produced, which was transmitted from the lip of zinc in the bottle to that in the tube, and the 2 slips having been connected by metallic wire, the slip in the tube became the positive pole, and that in the bottle the negative pole of the apparatus. Each bottle therefore produced as many currents as united would be sufficient to produce all the phenomena of the electric telegraph. Such was the ingenious and very simple apparatus constructed by Cyrus Harding, an apparatus which would allow them to establish a telegraphic communication between Granite House and the corral. On the 6th of February was commenced the planting along the road to the corral of posts furnished with glass insulators and intended to support the wire. A few days after, the wire was extended, ready to produce the electric current at a rate of 20,000 miles a second. 2 batteries had been manufactured, one for Granite House, the other for the corral, for it was necessary the corral should be able to communicate with Granite House. It might also be useful that Granite House should be able to communicate with the corral. As to the receiver and manipulator, they were very simple. At the 2 stations, the wire was wound round a magnet, that is to say, round a piece of soft iron surrounded with a wire. The communication was thus established between the 2 poles. The current, starting from the positive pole, traversed the wire, passed through the magnet, which was temporarily magnetized, and returned through the earth to the negative pole. If the current was interrupted, the magnet immediately became unmagnetized. It was sufficient to place a plate of soft iron before the magnet, which, attracted during the passage of the current, would fall back when the current was interrupted. This movement of the plate thus obtained, Harding could easily fasten it to a needle arranged in a dial bearing the letters of the alphabet, and in this way communicate from one station to the other. All was completely arranged by the 12th of February. On this day, Harding, having sent the current through the wire, asked if all was going on well at the corral, and received in a few moments a satisfactory reply from Ayrton. Pencroft was wild with joy, and every morning and evening he sent a telegram to the corral, which always received an answer. This mode of communication presented 2 very real advantages. Firstly, because it enabled them to ascertain that Ayrton was at the corral, and secondly, that he was thus not left completely isolated. Besides, Cyrus Harding never allowed a week to pass without going to see him, and Ayrton came from time to Granite House, where he always found a cordial welcome. The fine season passed away in the midst of the usual work. The resources of the colony, particularly in vegetables and corn, increased from day to day, and the plants that brought from Tabor Island had succeeded perfectly. The plateau of Prospect Heights presented an encouraging aspect. The fourth harvest had been admirable, and it may be supposed that no one thought of counting whether the 400,000 millions of grains duly appeared in the crop. However, Pencroft had thought of doing so, but Cyrus Harding having told him that even if he managed to count 300 grains a minute, or 9,000 an hour, it would take him nearly 5,500 years to finish his task, the honest sailor considered it best to give up the idea. The weather was splendid, the temperature very warm in the daytime, but in the evening the sea breezes tempered the heat of the atmosphere and procured cool nights for the inhabitants of Granite House. There were, however, a few storms which, although they were not of long duration, swept over Lincoln Island with extraordinary fury. The lightning blazed and the thunder continued to roll for some hours. At this period, the little colony was extremely prosperous. The tenants of the poultry yard swarmed, and they lived on the surplus, but it became necessary to reduce the population to a more moderate number. The pigs had already produced young, and it may be understood that their care for these animals absorbed a great part of Neb and Pencroft's time. The onagers, who had 2 pretty colts, were most often mounted by Gideon Spilett and Herbert, who had become an excellent rider under the reporter's instruction, and they also harnessed them to the cart either for carrying wood and coal to Granite House, or different mineral productions required by the engineer. Several expeditions were made about this time into the depths of the far west forests. The explorers could venture there without having anything to fear from the heat, for the sun's rays scarcely penetrated through the thick foliage spreading above their heads. They thus visited all the left bank of the Mersey, along which ran the road from the corral to the mouth of Falls River. But in these excursions the settlers took care to be well armed, for they met with savage wild boar, with which they often had a tussle. They also, during this season, made fierce war against the jaguars. Gideon Spilett had vowed a special hatred against them, and his pupil Herbert seconded him well. Armed as they were, they no longer feared to meet one of these beasts. Herbert's courage was superb, and the reporter's sang-froid astonishing. Already 20 magnificent skins ornamented the dining room of Granite House, and if this continued, the jaguar race would soon be extinct in the island, the object aimed at by the hunters. The engineer sometimes took part in the expeditions made to the unknown parts of the island, which he surveyed with great attention. It was for other traces than those of animals that he searched the thickets of the vast forest, but nothing suspicious ever appeared. Neither Top nor Jupe, who accompanied him, ever betrayed by their behavior that there was anything strange there, and yet more than once again the dog barked at the mouth of the well, which the engineer had before explored without result. At this time Gideon Spilett, aided by Herbert, took several views of the most picturesque parts of the island by means of the photographic apparatus found in the cases, and of which they had not, as yet, made any use. This apparatus, provided with a powerful object glass, was very complete. Substances necessary for the photographic reproduction, collodion for preparing the glass plate, nitrate of silver to render it sensitive, hyposulfate of soda to fix the prints obtained, chloride of ammonium in which to soak the paper destined to give the positive proof, acetate of soda and chloride of gold in which to immerse the paper. Nothing was wanting. Even the papers were there, all prepared, and before laying in the printing frame upon the negatives, it was sufficient to soak them for a few minutes in the solution of nitrate of silver. The reporter and his assistant became, in a short time, very skillful operators, and they obtained fine views of the country, such as the island taken from Prospect Heights, with Mount Franklin in the distance, The mouth of the Mersey, so picturesquely framed in high rocks, the glade and the corral with the spurs of the mountain in the background, the curious development of Claw Cape, Flotsam Point, etc. Nor did the photographers forget to take the portraits of all the inhabitants of the island, leaving out no one. "It multiplies us," said Pencroft, and the sailor was enchanted to see his own countenance faithfully reproduced, ornamenting the walls of Granite House, and he stopped as willingly before this exhibition as he would have done before the richest shop windows in Broadway. But it must be acknowledged that the most successful portrait was incontestably that of Master Jup. Master Jup had sat with a gravity not to be described, and his portrait was lifelike. "He looks as if he was just going to grin," exclaimed Pencroft. And if Master Jup had not been satisfied, he would have been very difficult to please, but he was quite contented and contemplated his own countenance with a sentimental air which expressed some small amount of conceit. The summer heat ended with the month of March. The weather was sometimes rainy, but still warm. The month of March, which corresponds to the September of northern latitudes, was not so fine as might have been hoped. Perhaps it announced an early and rigorous winter. It might have been supposed one morning, the 21st, that the first snow had already made its appearance. In fact, Herbert, looking early from one of the windows of Granite House, exclaimed, "Halloo! The island is covered with snow." "Snow at this time?" answered the reporter, joining the boy. Their companions were soon beside them, but could only ascertain one thing, that not only the islet, but all the beach below Granite House was covered with one uniform sheet of white. "It must be snow," said Pencroft. "Or rather, it's very like it," replied Neb. "But the thermometer marks 58 degrees, observed Gideon Spilett. Cyrus Harding gazed at the sheet of white without saying anything, for he really did not know how to explain this phenomenon at this time of year and in such a temperature. "By Jove!" exclaimed Pencroft, "all our plants will be frozen." And the sailor was about to descend when he was preceded by the nimble Jup, who slid down to the sand. But the orang had not touched the ground when the snowy sheet arose and dispersed in the air in such innumerable flakes the light of the sun was obscured for some minutes. "Birds!" cried Herbert. They were indeed swarms of seabirds with dazzling white plumage. They had perched by thousands on the islet and on the shore, and they disappeared in the distance, leaving the colonists amazed as if they had been present at some transformation scene in which summer succeeded winter at the touch of a fairy's wand. Unfortunately, the change had been so sudden that neither the reporter nor the lad had been able to bring down one of these birds, of which they could not recognize the species. A few days after came the 26th of March, the day on which, 2 years before, the castaways from the air had been thrown upon Lincoln Island. End of chapter 18. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.